Good evening. Thank you to the Libertad Foundation for this invitation, for this award.
A la Fundación Libertad por esta invitación, por este premio.
For this privilege of waiting for me to be the prosero.
De que me estuviera esperando el prócer.
And to begin with, I want to express my most energetic repudiation to the new attempt of murder suffered by President Donald Trump. We are facing a new wave of political violence on the part of the left, on the whole free world, which must be stopped at its beginning, because there are many who do not accept to lose in the battle for ideas and in the polls and resort to violence to make reality their failed ideals. These people are not compatible with democracy and must be punished with all the weight of the law. The reality is that we liberals think that we made a great mistake after the fall of the Berlin Wall of believing that was a mere evidence reached with the single fall of the wall it was enough, and the reality proved that it did not. And in fact, what Marxism did was to rebuild itself and give the cultural battle another aspects and transfer the struggle of classes to other types of debates in society. And the way they ended up taking the stage. That is why institutions such as this foundation are so important to give the cultural battle, since it is not only about management of politics, but there is also a very important part, which is the cultural battle. And the advances that we have been making since we have become aware of this have been so great that not only did we begin to win the debates, because we also had to learn to debate with them, but we also began to win them in the polls, and that has then deeply violent. That is why they have no problem with resorting to violence. For them, the important thing is their collective idea. And human beings are mere numbers, mere sheets or mere pieces on a chessboard. The reality is that they have no problem killing us if it is necessary. That is why we cannot abandon the battle in any of the three planes, but we have to leave them in evidence. Today's talk is basically to show that the ideas of freedom work. We were always accused, when we raised our proposals, that this was a problem of theory, but that in the practice it did not work. There is a phrase that the Dr. Alberto Venegas Lynch says, there is nothing more practical than having a good theory. And what I am going to show today is that the ideas of freedom work. And why do we have so much recognition in all the places in the world that we go? Because basically what we are proving is that the ideas of freedom work. That all that they said that it could not be done, in reality it is not that it could not be done, it was mere complacency of politics. Yes, it can be done and it works. Therefore, what this talk is going to deal with is to show that the ideas of freedom actually work, and that if we actually begin to embrace the ideas of freedom with greater force, we will have a future of prosperity. The first thing is to have touched the greatest sacred cow of politics, which was tax policy.
Lo primero es haber tocado la mayor vaca sagrada de la política, que era
There is a wonderful conference by the Colossus Federico Sturzenegger, and it is precisely that he says to overthrow all the myths of politics. Then, for example, they call it insult us and say, well, we need to adjust, and the most interesting thing is the question of quantum and time. Then, for example, I hear some who criticize today and fill their mouths saying all the things that do not seem correct to them, and that the truth is that at the moment they had to do things. It seemed to them that more than 1 point per year was a lot, that we were lucky enough to have reached the end of the first mandate at tax balance. And we, not only did we make the adjustment of almost 5 points of the GDP, that there basically remember that it is all in the crisis that was being generated and that was being gestated, with which there's also a lot of delinquency, and in that context we put the accounts of the public sector in order, thanks to the enormous task of the giant that I have as Minister of Economy, which is toto capito, and adjust to the GDP 5 points in a single month. Therefore, we went from having an accumulation of 20 deficit points in previous management to having a balance and making a deep adjustment. And this is going to have very important consequences in the way in which the adjustment was made. Because currently the policy has always done, the first option has always been to take on debt. For us to take a debt is not an option, because it is immoral, because this is to pass the account of the party present to our children, to our grandchildren, people who do not even yet have the possibility of defending themselves with the vote. Therefore, it is deeply immoral. Imagine that they go to the party and pass the account to their grandchildren. It is an important thing. The other is to raise taxes. It also seems important to us. It is a theft. It is an attack on property rights. In fact, if there's something that has characterized liberals of different views, whether, for example, Murray Rothbard or Milton Friedman, Hume pointed out that the true size of the state had to do with public spending. Therefore, we're at a national level. Not only did we make the adjustment by lowering the costs, not raising taxes, but lowering the cost, we also returned 2.5 points of the GDP, lowering more than 20 taxes and eliminating others. That is what was never done in Argentina. That is, we return money to the Argentines, and today the size of the public sector is national. About 15 points of the GDP in that, if we wanted to compare it with other times, we should correct for the act of world populism of the Presidium when it began to give pensions without contributions, which makes a way to the public sector higher in order to respect the rights acquired by the retirees. Therefore, we are at levels at least that should be 13% or less of the GDP spent at the national level if we corrected for that effect and were able to compare with the others. But not only did we do that, but also that was part of the problem. If you look at the numbers of 2023, the celestial line is the fiscal year, but the central bank had twice the deficit than the Treasury had. And that was a very complicated problem because we were facing a situation at where we had 4 monetary bases beating a day, about 9 monetary bases of debt and bases beating in a month. Therefore, we would have had an explosion of the debt of peso emission. And clearly, that would generate hyperinflation, added to the fact that we had a surplus of monetary that was worse than what was in the previous one of the Rodrigoso. And as I am telling you, the balance of the central bank was worse than what was in the time of Alfonso, and not to mention the situation of the debt in pesos. Therefore, that is where it was clear that hyperinflation was planted, with an inflation that was running at 1.5 daily. Because sometimes it seems that we forget where we came from the disaster that we had. However, unlike other stabilization programs, that they were looking for the bomb to explode. Or to make revelations where they destroyed the property rights, such as the Bonex plan. I say so, it is also very easy. Expropriating, it is a solution that is surely very simple for the politician, but it is very expensive for the good Argentines. We, thanks to the enormous task of Santiago Bosoli in the central bank, Vladimir, who is here, Pablo Cono himself, today Chancellor, we began to reconstitute public finances and the balance sheet of the central bank. And today there is basically no longer the quasi-fiscal deficit. That is, within all the aberrations that have been left us, we have cleaned the balance of the central bank. This is to say that we return to the Argentines 15 points of the GDP. If we add to that what we low taxes, we have returned to the Argentines more than $100 billion. Well, we are a liberal government. The natural consequence of having eliminated the fiscal deficit is that the debt does not rise. That is, there is no new debt. That is, the only thing we have to guarantee is a rollover. If you look at the picture, first see the note at the bottom of the page. How much was the debt in 2001, and see the one that is today, or the one that was in 2023, which was $525 billion. The debt rose $381 billion. So now we are going to disassemble another story. We have just disassembled the story of what cannot be adjusted. Now we are going to disassemble the story of debt. Who is in debt? Debt rose to $381 billion. During the government of President Macri, that rose $60 billion. It means that the remaining $320 billion are all from the Kichnerism, and that must be added to the debt withdrawal that they did when they restructured. Therefore, if there is someone who has brutally indebted this country, compromising future generations, it is the Kichnerism. And it is also interesting because the graph shown here shows a drop in our government.
Es interesante porque el gráfico puesto así muestra una caída durante nuestro gobierno.
What is going on in our government of $10 billion? However, there is a part of the country that is in debt, as it is measured in dollars. There is debt in Argentina that is conserved, that is to say that it has an inflation adjustment. It is an instrument that was created during 2002-2003. What is the point? The point is that if we omit the effect of exchange appreciation, given that inflation is running more than it is the exchange rate, that situation, what it does is that the debt falls $35 billion more. That is, those of you who are seeing what it does, it has the debt almost constant. It is because of the effect of being That is, if not, the debt would have fallen $45 billion. Well, if we are a serial payer and we save on debts, the opposite of this is how the debt-product relationship jumped, and the first thing to do is to be honest about the numbers, because another great lie of Kichnerism, no, because it came in devalued. I say it did not devalue, there was an average of more than 200%. That is, there was a relationship between the market exchange rate and the official exchange rate from 3 to 1. That was already, it was a matter of things that were swept under the carpet and that they did not want to be honest. That market, when there is a market price, there is, if there is not, that is not market. I say, if they do not put the number that they want, but they will not have a market, that is not market. So when that was honest, the real debt-product relationship was around 157%. Today that number fell to 73%. That is, Argentina, based on its tax policy so weak, is basically showing to be insolvent temporarily. That is why the debt-product relationship falls. But there is another issue that a large part of the debt we have is public. Intranet debt. So when we correct for public internet debt, today the debt-product relationship of Argentina went from about 100% to less than 40%. That is, Argentina's clearly on a path of intertemporal solvency. We are going to honor the debt sooner or later. The country risk is going to be destroyed because we are going to honor the debts. Obviously, another thing that is also important, you have to put things in relative. Because one cannot be deceived by the Kirchnerist story. If there is something that characterizes them, it is to tell lies and to deceive people with their lies. Another great lie that they make and usually repeat the Kirchnerist is, well, but now they celebrate an inflation that was the same that Christina had. It is interesting because what it did not seem that they did not know, uncle. The truth is that they are quite ignorant and quite rude, that is, in economy. In fact, he said that if the socialists knew about economy, they would not be socialists. And Libre himself said that knowledge in economics led to liberalism. Therefore, I am not surprised that in general there are people who cannot add 2 plus 2 even with n. Avocus, and the best exponent is the Soviet who governs the province of Buenos Aires. But apart from that, if you look at the dynamic that was taking place of inflationary acceleration, and in fact, Neyce Kirchner left more inflation than the one he received. If one corrects by the jump that inflation had in 2002, Christina left more inflation than Neyce Kirchner. In her second term, she had more inflation than in the previous one. In the government, Mauricio Macri, she ended up with more inflation than the one that Cristina Kirchner had led. And in the government of Alberto Fernandez, much more. Therefore, it was also being accelerated strongly. Sometimes they say, no, well, where are the data? The data. Look, they are very simple. Wholesale price tend to lead consumer inflation is something that answers a very specific question. That is why this graph is so important. because it shows in terms of historical dimension what it faced. WE faced something similar to what was the hyperinflation of 1991, but also the interesting thing is that the data were already public at the speed they ran at 1.5. W wholesale inflation was 54%, and if you consider that the amount money could be multiplied by 15 times plus the remaining monetary, that implied at least multiplying the Rodriguez, I think, multiplied by 6. If I remember correctly, therefore we would have multiplied by 12. Imagine all that multiplication when they do the account of about 15,000%. That is, and that without. The demand for money had been depleted. Therefore, we were facing a catastrophe that would have turned us into Venezuela. That is, imagine that the most trained of them during the pandemic published a note in Prav the 12th that said that when you emitted inflation went down. So imagine, it seems that they never found out about the secrets of monetary policy. That is why this graph is so important, because it shows in a historical dimension what they think. That was magic. No, that was pure and hard liberalism, control of fiscal policy, and control of monetary policy. And here they have it in a shorter temporal dimension. To see it more clearly, what was the acceleration that it had been taking and how it fell strongly. Does it mean that this is resolved? No, not at all. It is still a horrible number, 33%. The issue is where we were going, and to understand why today we have the numbers that we have. The first thing to understand is that for May of last year, prior to Manuel winning the election in the city of Buenos Aires, inflation had reached 1.5%. That is to say, clearly inflation was falling apart, despite all the bad things. I don't forget that if you open your mouth, inflation cannot go down by 8%. The most beautiful thing about all this is that we have it all documented. The other day, in an act of piety, we decided to publish some of the sentences and not the owners of the sentences. But the reality is that none of the consultants, except 2, can pass the track record test. They miss everything. Therefore, after having missed everything so much and so badly, I don't know how they feel about saying what is good or what is bad. I remember, for example, there was one who said that if we did everything well, and he always described that everything was bad. At least inflation did not go down by 400% the first year. So then, with what faces do they come to criticize? If we track all the consultants, except 2, they did everything wrong, with what moral authority do they come to speak? They started everything. It was almost the opposite of what they said. They did everything wrong. They said everything wrong, in addition to imitating what was happening in the central bank, a mixture of intellectual dishonesty and brutality. I did not forget that a consultant wanted to steal from Toto the central bank sanitation program. He called 4 times a day the partner at Toto. Come on. We have to stop accepting lies and hypocrites. But I am not going to avoid talking about this 33% because it makes sense. The reality is that inflation had started to fall and deeply, but after the result of May, politics decided to play. And wow, it played and played hard. It is interesting because they are also so intellectually dishonest that they do not even repeat my entire phrases. The entire phrase is inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon generated by an excess of money supply, either because the supply rises or because the demand falls. But both things happen simultaneously, which makes money lose purchasing power, and that implies that all the prices expressed in monetary units rise. And what happened from the election of May, a huge sabotage where businessmen, media, politicians, and opinionators basically tried to destroy the economic program, proposed 40 laws to try and to destroy the tax balance, as if it had not been a catastrophe to have a tax deficit. From the 22 crises that Argentina had from 1901 until 2023, of those 22, 20 have a tax origin that can be due to a high tax deficit or a scandalous and obscene tax deficit. And that is what they were going to do. They were going to break the tax bans. They generated so much panic in the population that we endure a race for the equivalent of 50% eventual. Never in life or in Argentine history has there been a speculative attack of such magnitude. Basically, we were able to resist the attack because of the solidity of the program. What did the dishonest people intellectually say? The United States saved them. Well, $2 billion in $41 billion in less than 5%. That is, how do they think they can carry all the explanation to something that represents 5%? We have to be very dishonest intellectually. And not only that, that fall in the demand for money. What did they expect to happen? It was going to jump the price level, and that dynamically is manifested as an inflationary acceleration, and it is what we were living, which later regrouped with the seasonality of the first quarter and with the consequences of the impacts of the war on the price of fuel. Therefore, it jumped the price level. And as a consequence of this, an inflationary acceleration was noticed. But the amount of money, the monetary base, is still the same. Consequently, sooner or later, the inflation will give way. And this happened because there was a fall in the demand for money. And the way of seeing the fall in the demand for money, there is a way that is quite simple to be able to infer it, which is by looking at what happens with the exchange rate and the interest rate. If you raise the interest rate, the exchange rate falls, or if you lower the interest rate, the exchange rate rises. However, when you are raising the interest rate and the exchange rate, it means that the demand for money is being depleted. So much in the Soviet saying that they were going to turn everything upside down, that they were going to break everything, that they were going to make a coup d'etat, that they were going to take the government in place, that they were going to take the country risk of 1500. If you add to that, as inflation came, the rate in pesos was obviously going to increase. The interest rate at times reached almost 200%, and it was located at 150%. That is not trivial, because not only the destruction in the demand for money made them jump the price level, and that it manifests itself in that transition as a high rate of inflation. But also something incredible. During the previous government, the monetary passives, the central bank oscillated between $35,000 and $45,000 million. That is, on average, $40,000 million. Basically, when the exchange rate jumped, They went to $35,000 million. They put themselves in a position when they reached $45,000 million, they attacked them, and so it was being corrected. That is to say that with $40,000 million of monetary passes, we had to be calm, because if basically the previous government of more than 200% inflation, it had accelerated the inflation rate. It had huge problems, and it had that amount. The question was, why was that number so solid? Well, that number was so solid because it was the opposite of the work capital of the economy. So nobody would have thought the companies were going to break work capital to attack speculatively. However, that also happened. The panic that was generated, that they were busy generating, was so great that the monetary passes fell to $20,000 million backslash. Then they climbed to almost 30,000, basically because we raised the rates, which is a way to increase the demand for money. But look at that level of barbarism that destroyed the working capital of the economy. What do they pretend? That after such a shock there would be no impact on activity? Obviously, the economy that had grown during the first quarter, the 6th, was accelerating to the 8th. It stopped dry. And also, when you already you bought the supplies, what are you going to do? What are you going to tell the producer? No, I don't want them, I take them, I return them. Or are they going to throw them away? No, they put them in the production system. So what happens? They are going to produce, but when they want to sell, they will take longer to sell. And when they want to charge, they will take longer to charge. What that does is stretch the cycle of cash. Consequently, they need more working capital. So, while the real sector demanded more working capital, the race against the weight of the economy. And that is why I contradict the capital of work. Because in the end, they're counterfeit to the central bank's monetary passives, those who know of monetary theory and know how to compute stock and flow balances, and they know how to calculate those balance sheets. They know that the counterpart is the working capital of the economy, the capital of work. Therefore, we had a contraction of the supply and a strong increase in demand. And of course, the interest rate was going to sky. The economy stopped growing, the jobs stopped growing, and salaries stopped growing. Obviously, people have a feeling of frustration in the last 6 months. It's not a coincidence, it's the effect of having destroyed the capital of work. Fortunately, the reconstitution of the financial and monetary situation makes the credit start to grow again. The capital of work is being reconstituted, and consequently the economy. In March, it seems to have shown the worst numbers. And in April, it starts showing signs of recovery. You can see it by looking at the collection. Consequently, this number is horrible, but we are going to defeat it. Because our commitment is to continue doing what the economic theory and empirical evidence say. And we are not going to leave a trace of our orthodoxy. Thank you very much. Another thing that they said is that if we make the adjustment, we can stop inflation, but it's going to destroy our level of activity. The GDP is 8% higher. The GDP is at its peak, at the peak of the series. What they said that we were going to sink into a Great Depression is false. The economy is growing. In other words, despite having made the greatest adjustments in history, the economy is growing. In fact, if they take the effect of the statistical drag that Kichnerism left us, which was a fall of 3, the numbers would be around 10% or a little more.
del 10% o un poco más.
In fact, if they take it from the floor that was touched in April,
Piso que se tocó en abril,
in fact, between March and April 2024, the economy has grown by 11%.
la economía ha crecido 11%.
That is to say that when at that moment I said that the worst has already happened, effectively, the worst had already happened despite the violent attack of politics
Del ataque violento de la política
against the economic program, that they could not take it into account, and that also the people in the election supported the program with 41%, taking 17 points away from Kichnerism. If the ME does not like it, we can look at it with the GDP in a quarter frequency.
con el PBI en frecuencia trimestral.
We are going to see similar numbers. So again, they said that the tax adjustment was transitory.
Dijeron que el ajuste fiscal era transitorio.
We are showing that it is permanent. We are lowering the inflation.
Bajando la inflación.
Yes, of course, there are oscillations. In fact, if you go and look for videos, both of Turters and mine,
Videos, tantos de Toto como míos,
from the second part of 2025, we explained that it was not a rectilinear and uniform movement, that it was not a perfect asymptote,
una asíntota perfecta.
precisely because we were seeing the parties that they were doing, causing the demand for money to fall. That is, the videos are there, we are here for them to check us.
Nosotros estamos aquí para que nos traqueen.
That is why today, in honor of Milton Friedman, we could say first the data.
Podríamos decir primero los datos.
And the data is showing that each of the indicators that I am showing
Que estoy mostrando,
merits that we did not act, that we are the best government in history,
en la historia,
whether you like it or not, to the left. The other thing is, no, but jobs are being destroyed.
No, pero se destruyen empleos.
If jobs are lost and the economy is being destroyed and everyone is unemployed, when I look at the numbers, the reality is that the number of jobs, since we have been in the government, has risen to 113,000 jobs. What is going on? What do the Kirchnerists do? They take the data that is bad and generalize it. Then they say, no, well, but the salaried employees, the formal ones fell to 241,000. Well, but the informal ones rise, the independent ones to 346,000 and the unregistered ones to 33,000. In the last line, I am not going to talk about it, because basically it was something that we wanted to lower, right? We wanted to finish with the New Yorkers. There are 50,000 more that we took out. But it doesn't matter. What I am saying is, having said this, yes, the economy created jobs. They created about 400,000 jobs. An economy that didn't create a single job since 2011. Not only that, but it can also say, no, well, but they are informal. Yes, of course, they are informal. But why do they think we are sending the labor modernization law? Precisely so that they can be absorbed by the formal sector. For that. And many say, no, this is a slight patina. Well, the first thing I could say is that since we are in democracy, we have wanted to take out a labor reform, and it never came out. The only ones who took out a labor modernization law were us. But not only did we take out a labor modernization law, we took out tax innocence. I mean, for the first time in Argentina, we reversed the burden of the proof. The Argentinians were always guilty until we demonstrated the opposite in front of the tax office. And today we are innocent until the tax office demonstrates the opposite. We also took out deficit zero. We also approved the agreement with the European Union, Mercado. We also took out the law of glaciers. We lowered the law of impeachability. Look at the number of things that were never done in Argentina, and this government did it. Thank you, Dr. Boric. Thank you, Martin Minham. Thank you, Colo, for this huge effort. Thank goodness that this government lacks politics. because we took out a lot of laws in a month and a half that no one took out in 40. We put the tax accounts in order, something that no one could do in 123 years. Thank goodness that we lack management and politics. Otherwise, we would be gargled with the electric guitar. Therefore, this proves that it is also a lying, that a job position is destroyed. Don't you like it? Well, look, it is what is in the light of the sinister legal plot that we had in this economy. And the other thing is that also say, no, salaries are falling apart. Look, the salaries that are truly falling apart are only falling apart from the public sector. Do you know who is the worst off in this economy in real terms? Nay, I am the only one who has not changed her salary since I took it. In fact, I'm the president who earns the least in America. And if someone made the adjustment fell on the public sector. There is a pay the tax. On the other hand, if you look at the registered private sector, it is practically tied, depending on where you take the measurement. But if you take the unregistered ones, they are winning by a draw. That is why it grows so much in that place of the economy, because suddenly there are places that did not surprise them. For example, how the economy of knowledge flourishes, and that suddenly now they export $10,000 million, when nothing happened before. Well, the characteristics of the labor market were all thrown into the informal sector. So there they have what happens. That is why it is quite dishonest intellectually to omit the data of the unregistered, when they are almost half of the population of what is the universe of those who work. That is, you have to be very dishonest intellectually, so to speak, in an educated way. That is, we should not let ourselves be deceived by the cukers. We should not give them space to come back. I am not going to let them go through any of the barbarities of the lying speech they have. Because whether they like it or not, we got 14 million out of poverty. We lowered poverty by more than 28 points. Because if they take it in the monthly sequence, we start with 57 when we are honest. Therefore, we are not going to let ourselves be saved. And thanks to the enormous management of Sandro Pettivoli at the Human Capital Front, and with the movement into analysis that Dr. Boich did to the picoterias, without spending another peso, the amount that came to the most vulnerable sectors was doubled. And we also put more money into social policy. Consequently, it hurts them or not to the left, to the progress and others, the ones who got the most people out of poverty, were the disheartened liberals. And at the lie, consumption is in its worst moment, historical peak. Guys, it changed the way in which it is sold. I mean, obviously, it seems interesting to me that those who take it and say, oh, well, why did they close the local market? I mean, it seems interesting to me that those who take it and say, oh, well, why did they close the local market? I don't know what else. And how do you buy it? For Mercado Libre? For Teman? For the other one? Come on. It changed the way in which it is consumed. Of course, no. It is too much work to look at the balance of Mercado Libre. Guys, they have been hacking, which is one of the best companies in Argentina, which I strongly adhere to, and I have a deep admiration for Galperin. Why don't you look at the balance once and see what is happening? With another form of consumption at this fine, No, the idea is to show what is wrong. Isn't it that it is changing the composition of consumption? If the GDP is rising, I mean, what do companies produce for? I mean, to accumulate stocks. I mean, that would blow up profitability, which doesn't seem like a reasonable hypothesis. That's where they have the most historical consumption. They don't let themselves be psychopathized by the liars, because the worst of all is when a lie is repeated. The other lie. Now, the type of change is very delayed. And then what? It is the craziest change delay in the world. We are going to reach $100 billion in exports. It seems, as my friend Ramiro Castanera says, and it is the economy of the 3 times $100 billion, $100 billion that we return to Argentina from the fiscal year to the Argentine year of good, because of which poverty fell. If in $100 billion of exports, and if in $100 billion of rigging, this economy does work. Here is the result of the current account. This is very interesting to compare it with other situations, because many times they want to compare what happens to the Argentine economy, what happened in 2017, to anticipate that a debacle is coming. Fails. That economy had a fiscal deficit of 6 points of the GDP, and the current account deficit of 7 points of the GDP. Its economy has fiscal balance, and has the current account practically tied. In fact, let me tell you something. The current account has to do with the deficit between savings and investment. And if you rent to the public sector of the medium, you release resources for the private sector. And I'm going to tell you something. If he had a current account deficit, without being the fault of the public sector, it means that the investment of the private sector is increasing. Therefore, we shouldn't be scared either. But even so, we don't have a current account deficit. And if it is generated by the private sector, it shouldn't be a problem either. Let's stop thinking like even. It seems that we couldn't. I no longer say that we didn't reach Adam Smith. We didn't even reach the physiocrats. We repeated the stupidity of the mercantilists. We say it can't be that we are so precambric. But not only that, another barbarity that they say, no, this program has a problem, it doesn't buy dollars. Well, there you have the dollar purchases of Néstor Kirchner of the 2 governments of Cristina. Does he bought in the government of Mauricio Macri? Does he bought in those of Alberto Fernandez? And we are the violets. At this point, compared, we are the government that bought more dollars since the return of democracy. See that for each indicator, I find a lie. It can't be that we let ourselves be psychopathic by the Kika. It can't be that we buy the lie from the journalists in excesses and corrupts. I'm going to skip this. But not only that, this economy was banked. A huge political shock last year. But this year, it also faced a tremendous negative external shock. And unlike other times, there's something like this that's happened. It would have taken us on. It would have generated a disaster in the exchange market. It would have generated a disaster in the prices.
un desastre en los precios.
In the face of this negative external shock, it found us with the public accounts and external ones in balance. And unlike other times where we lost reserves, the exchange rate, it took us to the clouds. As far as the year goes, we bought $7 billion. Come on. What part is not being understood? They don't let themselves be psychopathic by the KUKA. I understand that the KUKA speak for the KUKA, head of term, but it can't be that someone who has ever embraced the acidity of freedom eats LV stories. I can't believe that they take them for fools and that you buy them because some or the other lying journalist in excess cropped repeats that lie. And the worst of all is that that lie is not only on page 12 or on page 5N. Those who supposedly once defended the acidity of freedom and today are more absurd than page 12. But not only did the external shock catch us well, for having the public and external accounts in balance, it also caught us well in terms of oil. We cut Argentina's position. There they have the relationship between the tax issue and the energy position. Argentina, as Kristalina Georgieva pointed out, is the best country in the world in the current situation of external shock. And we go from situations that in another moment would have generated a mega crisis to having to buy gold from Salaloco. In fact, if you assumed an elasticity of the unit demand, this level of buying dollars would imply that if we hadn't bought it today, the exchange rate would be at 1100. Come and talk to me about the change delay. I mean, apart from the rudimentary. Look, I'm just going to make a reflection. The analysis of the change delay, looking at the type of real exchange, has to be very precarious intellectually to do that. First, because when you look at the Argentine experiments in the different programs of stabilization, when trust is generated, the currency appreciated. Now, if you want to be a country like the one left by the Kichnerism, and yes, the exchange rate is going to be in the clouds, because clearly you are in a situation tending to communism. So what do you want? How do you want it to go? It's going to go wrong. They're going to be destroying the capital. People are going to try to get out as they can. If the universal flood comes, the ticket for the ark is called dollars. Say, first point. When trust is generated, the currency appreciates. When they have impresentable governments, like the Kichnerism, the currency is depreciated. First point. Second, you have to take the trend. If Argentina is going to change, that greater relative growth that it would have to have, that is, if we start doing things right, it's going to generate a relative money demand increase with respect to the currency of reference, let's say the dollar, which is going to make the currency also tend to be appreciated for that. Not only that, but they also Medellin. Small piece of information. We made a correction of 15 points of the GDP in terms of tax deficit. What do you think? That doesn't have an effect on the exchange rate? To have lowered the public spending in real times, 30% clearly, is going to generate a more appreciated currency. If that's what the regards, and everything that is the shock, it's going to generate a more appreciated currency. The export shock, linked to mining, linked to releasing the resources of the field, linked to the oil and gas sector. It's obvious that the dollars are going to come out, even through our heirs, and the currency is going to appreciate. So, for those who kick with this, the question would be, well, what are they intending to do? Because we are liberals, we don't decide with our fingers which sector wins and which sector loses. We don't pick the winners. We don't choose to winners. We dedicate ourselves to level in the field, to running from the middle, to the mega parasite of the economy, which is the state. We dedicate ourselves to deregulating, thanks to the enormous work of the classes. Further custos nega. We removed more than 15,000 regulations. We raised more than 40 billion in economic freedom, an improvement that has no historical record. Therefore, that's what we do. Now, the question is, if you are going to ask me to protect someone, let's say, the question is, I am going to ask brutally, in terms of political utilitarianism, why should I benefit? 3 inefficient corrupts against 48 million Argentinians. Or is it fair to pay for ties that are 4 times more expensive? Or is it fair to pay for steel tubes that are 3 times more expensive? I don't think so. I mean, all the novas like us pay for it with more expensive gas, for example, because the tube is more expensive and the price of transport is transferred directly. I think that if I count it in terms of political utilitarianism, it doesn't close. Is that enough? No, of course not. The question is, and in terms of economics, is it efficient? Look, if the relative prices change, you are going to have a change in the allocation of resources. So, what you are proposing to me is to high twist the market's will by modifying the prices. All that. If someone won and someone lost, then I have to compensate the one he lost. That would be an aberration, because that would mean that you would want to omit this act of reassignment of relative prices change. Therefore, the sector that has to expand doesn't expand, and the sector that has to contract gets parasitized. Consequently, you don't progress. I am going to give you a more violent example so that you understand. Many of you will remember the pandemic, an element that was, sometimes it is in a book of mine called Pandanomics. There are a lot of things explained, but let's look at the case as a Barbie. In the face of the pandemic, there was a demand reassignment, the people who wanted to buy Barbies. Consequently, what we have to have happened with the relative price of Barbies, it would have to go up. And what would that do? That the resources would be reassigned from somewhere in the economy to Barbies. Now, if you take the attack, let's say, of a central planifier, which can be on different scales, but wanting to touch the prices is definitely a trait of interventionism. In that context, they think of doing populism and say, no, the price of Barbies will not go up because it is an emergency situation. How expensive populism would be in that case? Because there would be fewer Barbies, and consequently, more people would die. In fact, during the pandemic, we did populism. We did populism with Barbies. We did populism with vaccines. We did populism with tests. And the consequence was that if Argentina had been like a mediocre country, 30,000 people would have died. But those sons of bitches killed 130,000 Argentinians. In other words, they took the lives of 100,000 Argentinians for doing populism. Therefore, in some way or another, it is paid. In that case, it was paid for in human lives. In another case, it is paid with paralyze or with a waste level of life at the expense of the inefficient ones. The other day I listened to Salvador Di Stefano. He said a phrase, "It was great, it was great. I loved it." He says, "Did you see that now? Everyone eats eggs. So you have to make some eggs in different ways. An omelette, a scrambled egg. An egg, I don't know how it would be, but eat eggs." The question is, when people eat toast with eggs, do they put jam on top? Did someone think about putting jam on the eggs? Well, it is an interesting fact. They are sending the breaks of the jam producers. They don't realize the aberrations that these people who are sick of socialism say. What are they going to expect from the jam producers? And why that say, if that happens to the jam producer, nobody complains, and if it happens to Don Chitrentos, they scream in the sky. Why? Because he has more power. Not for nothing, Murray Newton Rothbard, the third volume of The Man and the Economy and the State, is called Power in Market. And let's say a similar title have been used a long time ago. From it, I strongly recommend reading it, because not only was it a theory first, but he was also a minister of economy in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Therefore, when he describes the things that occurred in power, I say it is worth learning a lot and to be much more measured when it comes to opinion, because I can assure you that sitting in the electric chair is much more complicated than being from a screen thinking. Beyond that, the most important thing is whether the Argentinians are well or not, and whether the policies are fair or not. So we saw that utilitarian in political terms does not work. In times of efficiency, it does not work. But even when it was the case of those benefits, if that policy were unfair, it would not be worth being carried out. So someone here comes and explains to me why stealing the fruit of the work of another person, seizing their freedom, is fine. Because for me, stealing and seizing their freedom is wrong. Both taxes as well as regulations are violations of property rights. And that is wrong. And those policies are unfair and inexorably will end badly. And you know what? We have empirical evidence in Argentina in the last 100 years that what we did systematically was to violate the right to property, and that is what sunk us. But beyond that, there's a very positive element to finish the presentation, because we already saw that the product is at its most historical. We saw that consumption is at its most historical. We saw that exports are at their most historical, that the regime is working very well, that credit is being recombined, with which everything makes us more optimistic forward. So the question is, if inflation is going to drop, and if the problem was that inflation was generated by a drop in the demand for money, then let's see what is happening with the demand for money. And we saw that if the central bank had not borrowed more than $6 billion, the exchange rate would be at 1100, and today the interest rate is around 20%. This means that the demand for money is rising, and that therefore inflation is going to drop. And if you look at this graph and look at the exchange rate and the local interest rate, Argentina, in this world context, was the one that performed best in terms of appreciation of the exchange rate and in terms of the interest rate drop. Therefore, the demand for money in Argentina is being recombined, Consequently, sooner or later, we are going to defeat inflation. Therefore, we are going to be in Argentina, the freest country in the world, and don't doubt that liberalism is going to get ahead. May God bless you all. May God be with you. Long live freedom, Kaoja.